Welcome to this predicted paper from Psychology Ninjas. This paper represents the best guess for the upcoming exams. Please use this paper in addition to your other revision. You can complete a unique version of this paper by going to our Psychology Ninjas site. Psychology Ninjas is full of free content to help you with your exams. You can save your scores with a free account. Which of these terms from humanistic psychology describes when an individual believes that they need to meet certain criteria from others to be accepted? 1 mark. This question is looking for us to identify which term is being described. So we need to read through our options, selecting the correct one. Our correct term is conditional positive regard, so we would select this box. Self-actualization is part of Maslow's hierarchy of need. Esteem, also part of Maslow's hierarchy of need, and congruence is the difference between our ideal self and our current self or our real self. Outline the way in which Skinner studied operant conditioning, 4 marks. This question has the command word outline. This requires us to give detail and extension to our response, thinking about giving The focus of this question is Skinner's research, and we would need to focus on his particular procedure because in this question we have the way in which he has conducted his research. So you're thinking about describing the procedure for this particular psychological study. Let's have a look at our response. Skinner designed a special cage in order to examine the role of operant conditioning called a Skinner box. The rat naturally explored the cage, and when it accidentally pushed the lever, a food pellet was released. The rat would continue to push the lever when hungry to get more food, and if pushing the lever did not release food, then the rat stopped pushing the lever. We clearly have an understanding of the nature of Skinner's research. We've identified that the cage was called a Skinner box, and then we've started to outline this and give a bit more information, talking about what happened when the rat pushed the lever, that it released a food pellet, and also what would happen if there wasn't a food pellet being released from the lever. However, this question is worth 4 marks, and so we want 4 separate details in order to extend our response. Although we've identified the Skinner box, that isn't enough detail to give an outline. We're going to continue our explanation by talking about a different study. Skinner conducted replications to test the role of reinforcers with other animals and found that behaviour continued if it was rewarded. When pigeons pecked a disc that produced a food reward, they continued to peck at the disc, showing that behaviours could be learnt. Identifying that Skinner studied other animals is important. However, how he studied the other animals is even more significant for this question. That this time with the pigeons, they pecked a disc rather than pulling a lever. Here we've got our 4 marks for outlining Skinner's research. Denise becomes intensely jealous when she sees her partner interacting closely with another woman, even though he insists it was innocent. She starts monitoring his behaviour by tracking his phone whilst he has gone out and shows signs of distress when he doesn't answer a message or phone call. Explain, according to your understanding of evolution, Denise's behaviour to her partner, 3 marks. This question has the command word explain, which means we need to give detail and extension to our response. Our explanation is focused on evolution, so we need different concepts within this particular theory. However, this question has a stem, and so we need to link this into Denise's behaviour and our particular ideas. This means that all of our 3 marks become AO2 marks, or application. It's really important that we use different parts of the stem to show breadth in our application. Here's our response. Her jealousy may be caused by natural selection that suggests that behaviours have adapted in order to help us survive. She experiences this when her partner is interacting closely with other women, due to her fear that their resources will be invested in someone else's survival. We've identified a key term within evolutionary theories as part of a biological approach, in terms of our discussion about natural selection. We've linked this into the stem by talking about her jealousy, and we're going to tick that off in our stem to make sure that we're using different parts of it throughout our response. We've got a second idea within evolutionary theories in terms of the allocation of resources in order to help survival. And again, this has been linked into the response and the information we've been given by the fact that her partner is interacting closely with another woman. We're going to tick this off as well in order to show again that we've used different parts of the STEM. However, our response is looking for 3 marks and we've only got 2 different ideas here. So we're going to go for an additional idea in order to get that final mark. Denise is guarding her partner by tracking his phone as an effort to prevent cuckoldery and her investment in their relationship being a waste of her limited resources to ensure her survival through children. We've developed our ideas within evolutionary theory, talking about the guarding of partners and also the investment of limited resources. We've linked one of these into the STEM by talking about how Denise is now tracking his phone, so that's where we get our 3rd mark. Again, we're going to tick this off. We've got 3 different links to the STEM for 3 different concepts in evolution for our 3 marks. Outline the cognitive approach. Compare the cognitive approach with the psychodynamic approach, 16 marks. This question has 2 different command words. We have the command word outline and the command word compare. Our command word outline requires us to give detail and extension for our response. We have 6 marks for our outline or our knowledge within this question. All of our outline needs to focus on the cognitive approach, explaining key details and terminology within this given approach in psychology. We're then going to go to our second command word, compare. This means that we need 10 marks of evaluation or comparison. This is looking at similarities and also differences within our response. We're comparing the cognitive approach with the psychodynamic approach, and we want to think about comparisons based on nature-nurture, determinism, psychology as a science, reductionism, anything where we can compare and give similarities and differences between the 2 approaches. We're going to start by outlining a particular concept within cognitive psychology. The cognitive approach suggests that all human behaviour is explained by our internal thought processes. As such, the cognitive approach focuses on the study of mental processes such as perception, memory, and reasoning. The cognitive approach assumes that thought processes can and should be studied scientifically. We've given detailed knowledge here about the basic premise of the cognitive approach and that behaviour is explained by internal thought processes. We've gone on to list some of these in order to show our knowledge and already begun to identify some possible evaluation. So let's move into that evaluation. Cognitive psychologists emphasise the need to use scientific methods in their exploration of memory by focusing on the development of standardised procedures that can be replicated. We've identified that cognitive approach focuses on scientific methods, and we've given a reason why, that it likes standardised procedures that can be replicated. Here we're talking about specific methodologies and using our psychological knowledge in order to explore this in greater detail. We're then going to explain this giving specific research. Laboratory experiments enable the control of extraneous variables so that cognitive psychologists can determine cause and effect relationships about the different nature of encoding between short-term and long-term memory. In Baddeley's study, participants were tested individually, with each of the words in the word list being presented for 3 seconds to ensure that participants completing the acoustically similar condition were comparable to the participants completing the semantically similar condition. We've given a detailed explanation of our support of the scientific procedures used within the cognitive approach, identifying a reason why they're using laboratory experiments in terms of cause and effect, and linking that into encoding. We've gone a step further by talking about specific details within Baddeley's study, and we've shown detail in this and specific precise knowledge in terms of how the words were presented and why that was done in terms of comparing the participants. It's now time to compare this to the psychodynamic approach. On the other hand, the psychodynamic approach is criticised for its lack of scientific methods and the reliance on case studies to support the role of psychosexual development. Freud's exploration of little Hans's phobia of horses using psychosexual development and its use as evidence of the Oedipus complex are problematic as they are not testable. However, Fisher and Greenberg's meta-review found support for the role of unconscious motivation and ego defense mechanisms within human behavior. We've given a difference here by talking about the lack of scientific methods within the psychodynamic approach. We've gone on further and we've given a specific example of a case study that Freud and the psychodynamic approach have used. We've gone for little Hans here, but you can use any case study within the psychodynamic approach. We've gone one step further and talked about how these concepts are not testable, and that's what makes them unscientific. We've given a further counter-argument for this within our discussion of psychodynamic approach, talking about Fisher and Greenberg's meta-review that is more testable and shows an idea of discussion within our response. To complete our response, we're going to give a judgment for our comparison between these two approaches and which is more scientific. Therefore, the cognitive approach is more objective than the psychodynamic approach, with a focus on high levels of control within the exploration of human behaviour. We've been definitive in our judgment here, saying that the cognitive approach is more objective. We're going to return to our outline now and go back to a different concept within the cognitive approach. Computer models are used to simplify and understand mental processes with the use of concepts such as storage, encoding, and capacity. Within the human brain, inputs come from the senses to produce outputs such as language and specific behaviours. We've identified computer models within our discussion of this particular approach. We've said that this has been used in terms of talking about storage, encoding and capacity, and we've given an example of inputs and outputs within the brain. You could compare this to a computer and give examples for inputs and outputs for a computer as well. We're going to return back to our discussion and our comparison between our approaches. The focus on the computer model creates machine reductionism by using the computer analogy to explain human behaviour. We've identified key terminology within exploration of an approach by talking about machine reductionism. And then we're going to explain this in more detail. The cognitive approach is limited in its explanation of complex human experiences that have not been created in computers, such as emotions, that limits its validity. It suggests that people are mechanistic and lack free will, therefore this approach is very deterministic. Both approaches recognise the role of internal processes, either in relation to our thoughts and cognitions, or the role of the unconscious on behaviour, thus developing our understanding of human behaviour. There's quite a lot going on in our explanation here, so let's break it down. Firstly, we've explained the problem with using machine reductionism, in that it limits the validity or accuracy of explanations of human behaviour by taking this approach. We've gone further and said that this particular approach lacks free will and therefore is deterministic. In our comparison, we've gone for a similarity this time, in that both approaches recognise the importance of internal processes, and we've given an example to link this point back to both the cognitive and psychodynamic approach. We're going to elaborate now by giving a counter-argument. Here we're going to talk about the psychodynamic approach in more depth. The psychodynamic approach is less reductionist, as the structure of personality examines how both innate factors produce reproductive instincts that shape the id, whilst the superego incorporates the internalization of social rules that is governed by the morality principle. However, it is also deterministic, in that unconscious factors are a significant influence on even minor behaviours. By discussing the role of the id and the superego, we explain how the psychodynamic approach is less reductionist. We've countered this by saying it is also deterministic, which is also a similarity to the cognitive approach, by talking about how just unconscious factors are the role and cause of behaviour. It's time to make a judgment once again. Although cognitive psychology is more reductionist, it makes memory easier to quantify and test. However, the more holistic approach of the psychodynamic approach is more valid when explaining complex human behaviours and their role within clinical conditions. We've identified that the psychodynamic approach is more holistic and the implications for this in terms of our judgment in that it is more valid. We're going to outline another concept within the cognitive approach. There is clear detail in our outline here. We've started with a clear definition of what schemas are and developed this in terms of the impact they might have in terms of strengths and weaknesses on our understanding. That schemas allow for quick processing of information but can easily be distorted. We're going to return to our other skill in terms of comparing our cognitive and psychodynamic approach. We're going to return to evaluation once again. As schemas are impacted by personal experiences and cultural expectations, they demonstrate the role of nurture. We've developed our comparison by linking this into nurture, giving a clear example of how schemas are affected by environmental influences. We're going to explain this using research. Loftus and Palmer's study demonstrates how leading questions affect the recall of memory. Participants who had the verb smashed gave higher estimates of speed in a car crash compared to participants who had the verb contacted. Furthermore, Freud also acknowledges the role of parents in the negotiation of each stage of psychosexual development. Our discussion of research gives a clear finding in terms of talking about higher estimations of speed in the smashed condition. We've also shown a similarity with the psychodynamic approach, saying that Freud also acknowledges the role of nature in terms of parents and psychosexual development. We're going to develop our similarities further here by talking about nature. Both approaches also acknowledge the role of nature on behaviours, as the nature of cognitive processing is innate and can be seen universally. Equally, the psychodynamic approach suggests that the demands and conflicts created with internal forces are also the result of nature. We've given clear examples from both cognitive approach and also the psychodynamic approach in how these are nature or inbuilt responses. We're going to complete this paragraph with a judgment. As both the cognitive and psychodynamic approach recognise the role of nature and nurture, demonstrating an interactionist approach to explaining human behaviour. We've drawn in our wider psychological knowledge here by understanding that if we're recognising nature and nurture, that is offering an interactionist approach. We're going to explain a different concept within the cognitive approach, this time looking at theoretical models. Cognitive psychology also uses theoretical models to look at the behaviour in a series of distinct steps. Multi-store models suggest that the processing of information goes through a sequence of stores from sensory memory to short-term memory and then long-term memory by using a sequence of processes starting with environmental stimuli, attention and then maintenance rehearsal. The use of models within cognitive psychology has enabled more complex behaviours to be tested. This response has focused on the multi-store model as an example of a theoretical model. However, we could use working memory model instead. We've clearly explained this using lots of terminology from the multi-store model. More importantly, we've also explained why this is beneficial, that it has broken down more complex behaviours and allows them to be tested. We're going to move into evaluation once again. Cognitive theories have validity because of their real-world application. The approach has led to the development of useful ways in understanding and treating psychological disorders. Whenever we're talking about real-world application, we can talk about them being valid or accurate. We could be more precise here in talking about external validity, that these apply outside a study or theory into the real world. By exploring the theoretical ideas of both Beck and Ellis, we're showing breadth of knowledge. We've clearly linked this into cognitive behavioural therapy as a particular treatment associated with the cognitive approach. We're going to look at a similarity once again, talking about the applications of the psychodynamic approach to also treat therapies. Let's compare once again to the psychodynamic approach. Freud's theories suggest that our childhood experiences have an impact on our adult personality. However, they do not acknowledge how other factors in adult life could affect mental health. Freud also introduced a range of therapies to help us to access the unconscious mind, such as dream analysis. Psychoanalysis can help to deal with unresolved conflicts, with Demat et al. Finding that psychoanalysis significantly improved symptoms long term. We've talked about the usefulness of Freud's theories, talking about childhood experiences. Being positive about psychodynamic approach will make us stand out as a candidate. We've gone further to identifying specific therapies within this approach and the benefits of doing so through research. It's time to come to a judgment once again. Both approaches offer a significant contribution to society in supporting clinical treatment, giving credibility to cognitive and psychoanalytical work. We've used our broader understanding of psychological terminology here to talk about credibility in terms of the validity of our applications using therapies from both approaches. We're going to form some final conclusions in order to complete our response. The cognitive approach is significantly more scientific compared to the psychodynamic approach, focusing on a methodology that promotes control. The use of the computer analogy has limited the holistic nature of cognitive psychology. Both approaches examine the role of nature and nurture to explain human behaviour, developing theories that are valid. The ability to develop therapies that treat individuals using both cognitive and psychodynamic approach show their external validity. Identify the area of the brain that is responsible for balance, 1 mark. Here we have the command word identify, which is asking us to specify or state a particular piece of knowledge. We're focused here on an area or region of the brain, and we're looking specifically about balance. We have to select one of our responses, considering which is involved in balance. The frontal lobe is at the front of the brain and is involved in impulse control, whereas the cerebellum is at the back. The brainstem is involved in reflex responses like breathing and blinking, whereas the hypothalamus is involved in threat assessment and the fight or flight response. Being at the back of the brain, the cerebellum is involved in balance, and that's what we would select. Describe the process of synaptic transmission, 3 marks. With the command word describe, we want to give detail and extension to our description. The focus of this question is synaptic transmission, and the functions and processes between neurotransmitters and the neurons in our brain. All of 3 marks in this question are focused on our knowledge. Here's our response. Synaptic transmission is the process of turning an electrical signal into a chemical signal and then back to an electrical signal in the brain. We've clearly identified a process here, with electrical signals and chemical signals being part of the process of synaptic transmission. An action potential travels down the axon and reaches the presynaptic neuron, triggering the vesicles to release neurotransmitters into the synapse. We have a range of terminology here, clearly identifying again another process in which neurotransmitters are released from the vesicles. Neurotransmitters travel across the synapse and bind to receptor sites on the postsynaptic neuron. There are different receptors for different neurotransmitters that work like a lock and key. Again, we've clearly explained the postsynaptic receptor sites as a third part of this process. We have 3 clear, distinct processes within synaptic transmission for our 3 available marks. Agatha has recently suffered from a stroke. It has affected her ability to move her left arm and leg, which means that she is going to physical therapy to help her to walk. Using your knowledge of the central nervous system, describe why Agatha's stroke has affected her in this way, 2 marks. Here we have the command word describe. This means we need to be detailed in how we're explaining our particular knowledge. There's some assumed psychological knowledge in this question in terms of the central nervous system. This means the brain and the brainstem. As this is a STEM question, all of our marks need to be linked back to Agatha, so we need to use 2 parts of the STEM for our 2 application marks. Let's explore our response. It is likely that Agatha's motor cortex has been damaged as she is having difficulties with walking. We've identified the role of the motor cortex, but it's more important here that we've talked about her difficulties with walking. We can tick this off in terms of our STEM to show our application skills. We want 2 different parts of the STEM for our 2 marks for application. Let's move on to our second mark. Agatha has had a stroke in the right hemisphere of her brain, as lateralization means that the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, affecting her left arm and leg. We've shown our knowledge of the central nervous system here by talking about lateralization. That our right hemisphere controls the left-hand side of our body and the left hemisphere controls the right-hand side of our body. We've linked this into Agatha's STEM by talking about her left arm and leg having an issue since her stroke, and we can tick this off in our STEM as well. We can clearly see from our STEM that we've done our 2 pieces of application for our 2 marks, as 2 different parts of the STEM have been highlighted. Outline and evaluate ways of studying the brain, 8 marks. We've got 2 command words in this question. Firstly, we have outline. This is asking us to give a detailed description of our content. We have 3 marks available for our AO1 or our knowledge on this question. That's focused on ways in which we are going to study the brain. Our other command word is evaluate. That's looking for strengths and weaknesses in terms of the different ways in which we can study the brain. We have 5 marks for evaluation in this question, so we want more evaluation than explanation within our response. Post-mortem examinations take place when the person dies and may involve examining the brain for tumours or lesions. These examinations may also involve slicing the brain into sections to examine the internal function of different regions of the brain. We've clearly explained how postmortems work and that they involve when people have died, and it looks at the brain for tumours and lesions. We've gone further in terms of how we might understand the function of brain structures in a postmortem. And now we're going to evaluate. An advantage of postmortem examinations is it was useful before technology was sufficiently developed to study the live brain. We've stated when postmortems were useful, and then we're going to explain specific examples of post-mortem examinations and the impact they have had on psychological knowledge. The identification of Broca and Vernix areas were enabled by post-mortem examinations. Charles Whitman was also examined on his request, establishing that he had a tumour on his amygdala, suggesting that this region of the brain may have a role in explaining aggression. Brain tissue can be examined in detail and deeper structures can be investigated. We've clearly explained in detail different examples in which postmortems have been used in psychology, looking both at the functionality of brain structures and also aggression as a behaviour. We're going to develop a weakness as a counter-argument. However, cause and effect is a problem. The difference observed can be unrelated to the behaviour. The nature of the death and the processes the brain is subjected to may influence the results obtained by researchers. Furthermore, some patients lose the ability to consent during their lifetime, and so this is needed from relatives. That may put relatives under pressure at a socially sensitive time, or they may retrospectively report different behaviours in their relatives to support conclusions drawn by the researcher. We've identified a number of different problems with postmortems in terms of the objectivity and validity of these conclusions. Also, we've talked about how the nature of the death itself may affect the brain and also consent. We're going to come to a judgment in terms of postmortems and we're going to come to a judgment about postmortems as a way of studying the brain. Postmortems have enabled new insights to be developed within psychology about the localization of brain function. We've clearly identified new insights as a great strength for this particular research method. We're then going to look at a different way of studying the brain, moving forward to look at functional magnetic resonance imaging. fMRI is a brain scanning technique that measures changes in blood flow in the brain, which indicates increased activity. Those with the most activity are shown in red or yellow, and those with the least in blue or green. In our outline here, we've focused on blood flow activity as a way in which we measure in the brain using fMRIs. We've also shown how activity is shown, and that's giving us detail for our outline. We're then going to evaluate fMRIs as a way of studying the brain. An fMRI is risk-free and non-invasive, so it can be used to measure activity in the living brain without causing harm. Because fMRI are looking at brain activity through blood flow, these make them non-invasive, and we've linked this into an ethical issue. We're then going to explore some advantages in more detail. The use of fMRI means that the response to specific stimuli can be measured, for example pictures of addictive substances and the responses of the dopamine reward pathway. It also produces high-resolution images that are accurate to the millimetre, producing a more sophisticated and detailed understanding of brain structures and their interactions than postmortems. We've explored strengths in details to avoid becoming list-like. We've given some examples of how they have been used in addiction, and we've also talked about high-resolution images and why this is better than our other brain technique. We're then going to give a counter-argument looking at problems or weaknesses with functional MRIs. On the other hand, it has poor temporal resolution, as there is a 5-second delay between the neuron firing and it being detected. It is also not measuring neural activity directly, so findings can be misinterpreted, decreasing the validity of the findings generated. We've used key terminology here, talking about temporal resolution. Anytime we're talking about temporal, we're talking about this over time. We're explaining the impact of this in terms of not directly testing neural activity, affecting the accuracy of this particular way of studying the brain. We're going to come to a judgment here to link all of our evaluation together. The ability to test the activity of the brain has enabled psychologists to explore the performance on specific tasks. When we move in to look at scanning techniques, we're starting to talk about the ability to test the brain in a live situation, looking at the performance and interaction of brain structures rather than just looking at structural differences between different components. We're going to form some final judgments now. Postmortems have enabled structural differences in the brain to be identified and examined in depth. Functional MRI have enabled the exploration of the functionality of the brain in an objective manner. Given the level of detail and depth of our knowledge about these two scanning techniques, that would be enough for our 8 marks. You could do more scanning techniques in less depth in order to answer this same question in terms of ways of studying the brain. Explain the findings from split brain research, 2 marks. We have the command word explain here, which means we need to give detail and develop our response. The focus of our question is split brain research, and we need to specifically give findings for our response. We want 2 separate findings from our 2 separate AO1 marks to show detailed and thorough knowledge. Let's have a look at a response. Sperry had images presented to either the left visual field or right. If it was shown to the right visual field, then participants could describe what they saw, but not if it was shown to the left visual field, as the messages from the right hemisphere could not process language or communicate with the other hemisphere where language can be processed. However, they could select a matching object with their left hand even if they could not describe it. The first part of our response is a bit of procedure, but we kind of need that in order to frame the discussion here. We've clearly given 2 separate findings, talking about what they found in terms of the right visual field, and whether the participants could describe it or not. And we've explained why that finding has occurred because of our knowledge of hemispheres of the brain. We've then given a second finding about matching the object if it was presented, even if they couldn't describe it. Discuss the fight or flight response, 8 marks. Here we have the command word discuss. This is asking us to do 2 separate skills. Firstly, we're being asked to outline. There are 3 marks available for our outline of the fight or flight response. We're also being asked in our discuss question to evaluate, giving strengths and weaknesses of the fight or flight response. We've got 5 marks available for that, so we need more evaluation than explanation. There are 2 different response systems to stress. The response to sudden stressors triggers the sympathetic nervous system, preparing the body for rapid action. The SNS signals the adrenal medulla to release adrenaline. The hormone adrenaline circulates the body, making the heartbeat faster and pushing blood to the muscles, heart and lungs. When the threat has passed, the parasympathetic nervous system reduces the stress response, slows the heart rate and reduces blood pressure. When we're talking about sudden stressors, we want to think about SAM runs fast, that the sympathetic nervous system is activating or signalling the adrenal medulla in order to release adrenaline. We want to explain how adrenaline has an impact on the body. We've also talked about a return to homeostasis by explaining the role of the parasympathetic nervous system as well. So we've explained for our first part of our discuss command word, and now we're going to move into evaluation. The measurement of hormones can be objectively tested using blood samples, enabling a scientific investigation of stress. Here we've talked about objectivity, and that by doing so we are removing personal bias. We've also indicated our wider psychological knowledge, understanding that this is a feature of science. We're going to explain a counter-argument next in order to show logical chains of reasoning. However, these are often baseline measurements, rather than the hormone levels associated with sudden stressors that are more likely to elicit a fight or flight response. When we're looking at blood samples, we're talking about a baseline measurement, or where we are normally. We're not going to be in the middle of a stressful situation taking a blood sample, and therefore this has an issue for our understanding of the fight or flight response. To counter this, we're going to explain how else we could study the fight or flight response, or stressors. To be ethical, research relies on self-report questionnaires asking about stressful events in the form of life change units, which is problematic because of social desirability bias, as people tend to underreport the effect of stress. We've shown our understanding of how questionnaires are used, and we've given a bit more detail in terms of life change units. You wouldn't necessarily need to include this, especially if you haven't done stress as one of your options. However, what is important is we've said the impact of using questionnaires. Social desirability bias is saying what is normal or what we perceive to be normal, and therefore we've reduced the validity and underreported the effects of stress. We're going to link this all together, giving a judgment next. The lack of validity in measuring stress is problematic in creating causal explanations for fight or flight responses. So we've discussed our lack of accuracy in terms of cause and effect. We're then going to discuss our other response to stressors. The response to chronic stressors is called the HPA axis. If the brain continues to perceive stress, the hypothalamus releases CRH into the bloodstream. Once the CRH reaches the pituitary gland, it produces and releases ACTH, which travels in the bloodstream to the adrenal glands. We've got key terminology here in order to explore and explain the HPA axis. Talking about CRH, and you can learn the full name or you can use this abbreviation, and we're linking that to ACTH produced by the adrenal glands. And then we're going to give a bit more evaluation to the fight or flight response. Fight or flight takes a reductionist view to stress. We've used key terminology here, saying that it's a simplified viewpoint. And then we're going to explain why it's too simplistic. Individuals who experience sudden stress may freeze instead of having a fight or flight response. Individuals who grow up in a stressful environment have larger amygdala volumes and show an even greater response to stress. They may fib, flop, faint, or even flap. We've given a clear explanation of why it's reductionist, talking about a freeze response and a range of responses that we might have to a stressor. And then we're going to elaborate. Moreover, freezing may be an adaptive response that focuses the attention of the individual under stress and allows them to look for additional information to respond to the threat. Our elaboration here is a continuation of our discussion, talking about why the freeze response may be beneficial. By talking about it being an adaptive response, we're linking this back into our threat survival and evolutionary explanations. We've explained why it might be adaptive and help survival. We're then going to form a mini judgment once again. Although the physical response to stress is the same, these explanations are not enough to account for the range of human behaviours shown in the stress response systems. So again, we're going back and explaining that this is not valid, it's not accurate, because it's too simplistic. We're going to do a final piece of explanation once again, just to secure and bolt on that third mark. ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex, down by the kidneys, to release cortisol, which gives a quick burst of energy and lowers sensitivity to pain. However, this lowers the immune system, which may result in illness for people who have chronic stress. It's really important that we identify that it's the adrenal cortex involved in the HPA axis. We've clearly explained the response to this within the body, showing our biopsychological knowledge. Let's evaluate once again. Fight or flight responses to stress show beta gender bias as they underestimate gender differences. We're using key terminology here in order to show our wider psychological knowledge. We're then going to explain this further by using psychological research. Taylor et al. Found that women tend and befriend rather than showing the fight or flight. This involves protecting themselves and their children through nurturing, tending, and forming protective alliances with other women, befriending. We've clearly explained this research, giving specific details, focusing on how women are different. We're going to explore this further by giving an additional piece of research showing gender differences. Furthermore, Lee and Harley found that gender differences were the result of genetic variants, with males having the SRY gene on their Y chromosome, which promotes aggression as a response to stress, as well as releasing adrenaline to increase blood flow to the organs. In females, the absence of the gene and the action of estrogen and oxytocin prevent fight or flight responses to stress. Here we've talked about a genetic variant having an interaction within our stress responses, showing a difference with males having the gene and females not. We've linked this into specific other hormones that would be important in explaining these gender differences. And then we're going to give a final judgment. Gender differences in fight or flight responses have external reliability. By stating that they have external reliability, we're saying there's a consistent research picture that says that gender has an impact on the fight or flight response. We're going to come to some final conclusions in order to complete our essay. The lack of validity in the methodology to examine stress responses limit explanations for fight or flight response. Variations in the responses to stress show that exploring just fight or flight responses is reductionist. Gender differences in responses to stress suggest that biopsychology alone cannot explain response to sudden stressors. A group of psychologists conduct research into the impact of music on worldviews. They select students from 3 sixth forms using a random number generator using students' candidate numbers. They are asked to answer a questionnaire about their views on a number of world issues, including climate change. Students record their answer on a Likert scale, recording whether they strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree to the statements given. The students are then exposed to 30 minutes of either heavy metal or reggaeton music via headphones and then asked to repeat the questionnaire. Both the types of music selected were not consistent with their usual music preferences. Students were tested 1 week later using a different range of statements about a number of world issues, including views on gender equality. A worldview score was recorded out of 100 based on an average score between the 2 questionnaires. A higher worldview score showing more positive worldviews and a lower worldview score showing more negative worldviews. Explain why the experimental design chosen in the worldview study was appropriate. 2 marks. We have the command word explain here, requiring us to give some detailed and extension to our response. There is some assumed psychological knowledge in this question, in that we understand what experimental designs are. Experimental designs are what's happening with our participants and how they're allocated between our conditions. The focus of this question is why this experimental design is appropriate. One of our marks is identifying why that particular experimental design is appropriate for this particular study. This means it needs to link back to the worldview study. So this identification mark is actually an AO2 mark. We then need to justify why that is appropriate. So giving that a link back to why this particular design would be appropriate for the aims of this particular piece of research. Let's break down a response. The psychologist selected a repeated measures design to eliminate participant variables about worldviews affecting the validity of the study, as the gender of the participant may have had more of an influence than the music that they had listened to in the study. In our response, we've identified that this is a repeated measures design. We've gone back to our STEM to see why it's a repeated measures design. We've got that all the students were asked one questionnaire on climate change, and then all the students were asked another questionnaire, this time with gender equality statements. Although we've correctly identified that it's a repeated measures design, that's not what our question is asking us to do. We need why this is more appropriate, and we've started to do that by talking about it eliminating participant variables. We've also said the impact of this on our study in that it would affect the validity. However, we've got to have a non-generic response, and here we've selected a particular participant variable in terms of gender that might have more of an influence than the music they listen to. Describe how the psychologist could use counterbalancing in the worldview study, 2 marks. Here we've got the command word describe. This is asking us to give detail and extension to give depth to our response. For our 2 marks, we need 2 separate ways in which we would employ or implement counterbalancing, because we have this describe how question. This is assumed knowledge that we understand what counterbalancing is, and we need to link this back into the worldview study in 2 separate ways to show that we understand the STEM and can apply our knowledge. Because there's a STEM, both of these marks are AO2 marks, meaning that we need to have application within our response 2 separate times. Here's our response. Counterbalancing could be implemented by the psychologist by having some participants completing the questionnaire that includes views on gender equality first, and then the questionnaire that includes climate change. A separate group of participants would have the questionnaires the other way round. Our understanding of counterbalancing is demonstrated in our application of this idea of ABBA, that some participants would have condition A or complete the questionnaire first, and then a different questionnaire second, and a separate group of participants would have this the other way round. We've linked this back into the context of the STEM by saying that some participants would complete the questionnaire on gender equality and then climate change. So we've got 2 different links into the STEM. We have some results in Table 2. Table 2 shows the mean and the standard deviation for the effect of music on worldviews. Heavy metal has a mean of 39.6 and a standard deviation of 21.2. Reggaeton has a mean of 67.8 and a standard deviation of 13.9. Explain one conclusion about the effect of music on worldviews based on the standard deviation of the heavy metal condition shown in Table 2, 2 marks. Our command word here is explain, so we need to give some detail and extension to our response. This question is focused on conclusions. We have 2 marks available for our question, and one of our marks comes from identifying a conclusion. However, this is a STEM question, and so this needs to link in to the specific data that we have been presented with. Our conclusion needs to link back to the worldview study, and we got some more information in our question. We need to be focusing on the standard deviation of the heavy metal condition. We need to justify the conclusion that we have drawn by using specific data from the table. This gives us our second mark, our justification mark. Let's have a look at a model answer. A standard deviation of 21.2 is high, showing that the worldview score in the heavy metal condition is quite spread out, with some participants having much higher or lower scores. So listening to heavy metal music does not consistently produce a negative worldview. The identification of our conclusion is actually at the end, that listening to heavy metal music does not consistently produce a negative worldview. We're using two different parts of the STEM to come to this conclusion. Firstly, we're looking at the mean score and the mean score being lower. Secondly, we've taken this information from the STEM that a lower worldview score means that it's more negative. Therefore, we can say that listening to heavy metal does not consistently produce a negative worldview. We're then going to justify this conclusion using data from the table. We've picked out our standard deviation score of 21.2, and we've interpreted this saying it's a high score, meaning that the results are more spread out. That has an impact, meaning that the heavy metal music isn't the only variable having an impact on our conclusions about negative worldviews. The researchers wanted to see if there was a significant difference in the type of music and the worldview score. They conducted a Wilcoxon t-test and found an observed or calculated value of 14 for a 2.5% level of significance, with a one-tailed test based on the results of 12 participants. Explain what this shows in terms of the effect of type of music on worldviews. 2 marks. This is an explain question, which requires us to give some detail and extension to our response. In this question, we want to know what it shows, and this is some assumed psychological knowledge. We need to return back to our STEM in terms of looking at what this shows. So we need to determine whether there is a significant difference in our response. An identification of whether this shows a significant difference for this particular data set is going to give us one of our marks. By using the data, this is an application skill. Our second piece of application is going to come from the impact of this, i.e., what does that mean in the relationship between our two variables? Our first job is to find our critical value, and we're going to use this information from the STEM. The STEM tells us that we have a one-tailed test, and we're using 2.5 as our level of significance. Therefore, we're going to go down this column in order to determine which value is our correct value. We have a number of participants, or N, is 12, because we have 12 participants. So our critical value is 13. Let's break down a response, taking that information of our critical value. The calculated value of 14 is more than the critical value of 13 at the 2.5% level of significance for a one-tailed test, so there was not a significant difference between the type of music affecting the participants' worldview. We've identified our significant value, and we've used all the information from the STEM in order to get that, showing our application skills. We've then determined that this means that our results are not significant. And what that means? Well, that means that the type of music is not affecting the participant's worldview in a causal relationship. A research team are interested in whether belief in the paranormal was affected by culture. A self-selected sample of 10 participants was recruited from a university campus in the UK, Japan, America, and Brazil. They were interviewed about what beliefs they held about the paranormal using a semi-structured interview. All the participants were asked about their beliefs on ghosts, faith healing, and their beliefs on life after death. As part of the interview, the participants were also asked about any other beliefs that they held as an opportunity to gain new insights on paranormal beliefs that the research team might not be aware of. The research team collected quantitative data in the number of beliefs held about pre-existing paranormal beliefs. They also collected qualitative data, recording the responses that the participants gave to the open-ended question about any additional beliefs that the participants had. Explain one strength of collecting qualitative data in the paranormal beliefs study. 2 marks. This question has the command word explain, which means we need to give detail and extension to our response. The focus of this question is a strength, and so all of our marks need to come from describing a strength. The assumed knowledge in this question is that we understand what qualitative data is. There are 2 marks in this question, and we get 1 mark for identifying a particular strength of qualitative data. Because this is a STEM question, that strength needs to be linked into the paranormal belief study. Therefore, this becomes an AO2 mark. Our second mark is then to justify that, to say why that is a strength for this particular piece of research. time to have a look at a response. By collecting qualitative data, the research team can access information about the meaning paranormal beliefs have for individuals, increasing the validity as the researchers understand what beliefs are held and why participants have them. We've identified our strength in that our qualitative data gets the meaning behind individual paranormal beliefs. We've justified that by saying that this increases the validity of the study and we understand what beliefs are held and why they are held. Explain how the research team could analyse their qualitative data, 2 marks. Here we have the command word explain, which means we need to give detail and extension to our response. There is some assumed psychological knowledge in this question in that we understand what qualitative data is. This is written data, and we can remember that by the L in qualitative. This question is focused on how we're going to analyse that data, or how we're going to break it down in order to draw some findings out and understand this piece of research. As this question has a stem, we need 2 separate ways or 2 separate ideas for our 2 AO2 marks. Both need to be linked into the context of our stem in order for us to gain lots of marks for this particular response. Let's have a look at our answer. The research team could create behavioural categories for the additional paranormal beliefs held by the participants. For example, being able to move objects or communicate with dead people. We've demonstrated our understanding of qualitative data analysis by talking about behavioural categories. We've then linked this into the STEM by giving particular paranormal beliefs that we'd be creating those behavioural categories about. We're going to tick this off in our STEM in order to show a variety of application skills. We need a second idea in order to get our second mark. The research team could tally the number of times that behavioural categories appear in the transcriptions of the participants' responses to the question about additional beliefs to compare them cross-culturally. We've understood that in qualitative data analysis, we need to tally up the times that a particular category appears. We've linked this back into the STEM, not only talking about the response to the open question, but the aim of this piece of research in order to study cross-cultural beliefs. We've returned back to the aim of the study in order to get our second application mark. Table 3 shows the mean and standard deviation for the number of paranormal beliefs. The UK has a mean of 6.3 and a standard deviation of 1.06. Japan has a mean of 4.66 and a standard deviation of 5.85. America has a mean of 7.55 and a standard deviation of 5.29. Brazil has a mean of 2.32 and a standard deviation of 9.65. Using Table 3, explain 2 conclusions about the effect of culture on paranormal beliefs, 4 marks. For our command word explain, we need to give a detailed and extended response. This question is looking for conclusions, so outcomes about our particular aim. Given that it's a STEM question, we need to be linking this back to, or our conclusions need to be about, the effect of culture on paranormal beliefs. Given that we need 2 conclusions, we're going to think of this as 2 2-mark questions. For each of our 2 marks then, we get 1 mark for giving a particular applied conclusion. Our second mark comes from justifying why that is a conclusion. We justify by giving findings from our table. Let's have a look at a particular response to this question. Individualistic cultures have more paranormal beliefs, as both the UK and America have a higher mean than Japan, as 6.3 and 7.55 are greater than 4.66. We're starting with the mean score, or the average score. We're giving a particular conclusion, identifying that specific countries have more paranormal beliefs, by comparing different values. We've understood that individualistic cultures, and our examples of those are the UK and America. We're comparing that to different cultures that are collectivist, and our collectivist culture is Japan in our STEM. We've justified this by comparing our values, saying that 6.3 and 7.55 are bigger than 4.66, so that's why we can give this conclusion. You can manipulate the data and explain the difference instead. We're then going to go for a second conclusion. Although Brazil has a lower mean number of paranormal beliefs than all the other countries, this is inconsistent, as the standard deviation of 9.65 is the highest, so some subpopulations may have more paranormal beliefs. Our second conclusion is that some subpopulations within Brazil may have more paranormal beliefs. We've justified that with our figure from the table, talking about 9.65 and the standard deviation. We've understood that standard deviation tells us how spread out that score is around the mean. The fact that Brazil has a much higher standard deviation means we've got more spread in our data. Explain one improvement that could be made to the paranormal belief study, 2 marks. The command word explain requires us to give detail and extension to our response. This question is looking for an improvement, so how could we make this study better? We get 1 mark for identifying our improvement. However, because this is a STEM question, that identification needs to be given in the context of our STEM, in this case, the paranormal belief study. We then need to justify why that is an improvement. Now, we need to be careful here that we don't just go into a weakness of that study. We have to say why that thing that we have done would make this study better. The research team should include researchers from both individualistic and collectivist cultures, so that the questions asked about paranormal beliefs in the interview are not imposing individuals' values about paranormal beliefs. Here's a response. The research team should include researchers from both individualistic and collectivist cultures, so that the questions asked about paranormal beliefs in the interview are not imposing individualistic values about paranormal beliefs. We've identified a particular improvement to this study, in that it should have researchers from different cultures, and we've identified different cultures, and that's showing our psychological knowledge. The fact that we've talked about culture is important for this study and shows that we've put this in context. We've returned to our aim and the top of this in our STEM in order to show that we're continually accessing application marks. We've then justified why that is an improvement, that we're not imposing individualistic values about these beliefs. It's important here that we can't just use paranormal beliefs because that is in the question and doesn't show application skills. A psychologist is interested in the development of helping behaviours in children in preschool. They believe that children who are raised by parents who have pro-social professions, such as nursing, are more likely to be pro-social with their peers than children who are raised by parents who have competitive professions, such as a stockbroker. The psychologist collects information about the parent's profession through sending a questionnaire home to 10 local primary schools with a nursery. A series of closed questions are asked, including the critical question of the profession of each parent, which is then coded as pro-social, competitive, or neither. The psychologist then conducts a study with each child to determine whether they were helpful. A child of a similar age, but who wears a different uniform, walks past the child and then drops the books they were carrying on the floor. The psychologist then records whether the preschooler helped to pick up the books or not. Explain one way in which researcher bias could have influenced the validity of the pro-social behaviours study, 2 marks. In this question, we have the command word explain, which means we need to give a detailed and extended response. There is some assumed psychological knowledge here in that we understand what researcher bias is. This is some way in which the researcher might be influenced towards a certain outcome. Our first mark comes from identification of a way in which they might be biased. Our second mark comes from justifying. This means we need to explain why the thing we have identified is going to affect the validity or the accuracy of this study. Let's have a look at a response. The researcher could be biased in which professions they classify as competitive based on their personal beliefs. The psychologist may believe that a doctor is pro-social, whereas a different psychologist may believe that it is a competitive field to get into, creating subjectivity. We've identified that classification is a way in which researchers might have bias. We've linked this into the STEM, giving context by identifying that the competitiveness of the profession might be the thing that is biased. We're going to tick this off in our STEM to show that we have given context and a range of ideas. We've justified that in terms of subjectivity, and the accuracy of this study is being challenged by the subjective interpretation of careers. We've developed our example of competitive nature and classification through the use of a doctor, of how it might be pro-social or competitive. Explain how the psychologist could use opportunity sampling in the helping behaviours study, 2 marks. This question has the command word explain, which is asking us to give detail and extension within our discussion. It has some assumed psychological knowledge in that we understand what opportunity sampling is. And this question is focused on how we would conduct that sample. So we need to put ourselves in the position of the researcher and how specifically we would do that if we were them. There's 2 marks available for these questions, but this particular question is all about application, and so it has to link into the STEM and the scenario of helping behaviours study. Let's have a look at an answer. The psychologist could go to some preschools attached to a hospital and some in affluent areas in order to access parents with pro-social and professional jobs. The children that attended the preschool on the day that the psychologist attends would be participants in the study. We need 2 separate links to the STEM. So we've started by saying that we're going to access preschools attached to a hospital and in affluent areas. We've used information from our STEM here for our 2 different types of parents, having nurses with our pro-social behaviours and stockbrokers are more competitive. We understand that opportunity sampling is about whoever has attended on a given day, and we've put that into context by thinking about this as preschoolers, and so that shows that we've understood beyond what's in the question. We're going to highlight in here that we've got a nursery for our sample. Identify the type of alternate hypothesis used in this study. Explain why this type of hypothesis would be suitable for the researcher to use, 2 marks. We've got 2 command words here for our 2 parts of our question. The first one is to identify. This is to state something about this particular piece of research. Our second one is to explain and give some extension on why that is the case. We have some assumed psychological knowledge in this question in terms of what an alternative hypothesis is. This is any hypothesis that isn't a null hypothesis. The alternate hypothesis would have to be put in context, and therefore we have an AO2 mark here. We then need to explain why this is appropriate, and that would be a justification mark. So we get 1 mark for identifying what type of hypothesis, and 1 mark for justifying why it's used. The psychologist is using a directional hypothesis in the helping behaviours study. As previous research has been conducted into the developing of helping behaviours, it would be suitable for the psychologist to use. We've identified an appropriate alternate hypothesis by talking about directional hypotheses. We've put this in the context of the study by talking about helping behaviours. We've justified it by saying that there is previous research to studying helping behaviours, and therefore it makes it suitable. Explain what is meant by a type 1 error, 1 mark. Our question has the command word explain, which means we need to give some detail and extension to our definition. We have some assumed psychological knowledge here in not only knowing about what errors are, but what a type 1 error is. This is a knowledge question, so our marks here are all AO1. Let's have a look at an answer when the alternate hypothesis has been incorrectly accepted. Here we have a clear understanding of an error in that we've incorrectly done something. By incorrectly accepting the alternate hypothesis, we've said that something is happening in our study when it isn't. A psychologist decides to investigate the impact of watching an opposite-sex role model play with gender-stereotypical toys on the selection of a gender-stereotypical toy by children in a controlled observation. The children watched a video of a role model playing with the toy and then were taken to an observation room to play for 10 minutes. A range of gender-stereotypical toys for both genders were available in the observation room. The observer records the number of toys played with using time sampling. Table 1 shows the results from the observation of stereotypical toys played with. Along the top, what we have is the recording of time in minutes, so between minute 1 and to minute 2, minute 2 to 3, 3 to 4, etc. We've got two different sets of scores, one from observer 1 and one from observer 2 in our table. Draw a scattergraph to show these results, 3 marks. Here we have the command word draw, so we would need to sketch out or draw this particular graph. We have some assumed psychological knowledge here in that we understand what a scattergram or a scattergraph looks like. So within our response, what we'd want to do is draw out our 2 axes on our graph paper that's provided. We'd want to have an appropriate scale for each axis. So this is going to be from 1 to 10, and this one is going to be from 1 to 10 as well. Each time slot is going to be 1 point on our graph. So we're going to have observer 1 on this axis and observer 2 on this axis. Where they meet, that's where we're going to put our cross. We're going to do this for each of our time slots. We need to be consistent that observer 1 is always on one axis and observer 2 is always on the other. We then want to give our graph a title. A scattergraph or scattergram to show the relationship between observers of stereotypical toy play. Our final mark comes from giving both of our axes a title. Now we need to know what we're recording, so number of toys by observer 1 and number of toys by observer 2. The psychologist wants to test the reliability of the observers. Suggest an appropriate statistical test that could be used to do this, and explain 2 reasons for your choice in the context of the study, 5 marks. There are 2 different command words within this question. The first one is suggest. Within our suggestion, we need to identify an appropriate statistical test that we can use, and this is an AO1 mark. Our second command word is to explain, and we need to give detail and The second command word is explain, and we need to give detail and extension to our explanation. Because this needs to be in the context of our study, this becomes AO2 marks to explain why that's appropriate given this particular scenario. Whenever it comes to selecting statistical tests, you need a strategy to help you remember. We suggest that you use never chuck chocolate sponge in my red wellies spur. Sounds a bit bananas, but we're going to have a look at this and break it down, hopefully making it more simplistic and understanding what we're doing. The first thing we're looking to do is identify whether we have nominal data in our scenario. If we've got nominal data, then it's based on categories. Let's have a look at how our DV is measured. It's the number of toys being played with. So that's not a category, so we don't have nominal data. Therefore, we're not going to be doing a chi-square because we have not got nominal data, making it at least ordinal. It's then time to ask a few more questions. Our next question is whether our study is correlational or not. Here we're looking to test the reliability of our observers, or look at the relationship between observer 1 and observer 2. This means that our study is a correlation. So we can tick that it is a correlation. If it wasn't, we'd be looking at whether it's a test of difference and then whether we've got an independent or repeated measures design. We don't need to include that in the purpose of this particular question though. We have two different types of tests, and these are either based on parametric data or non-parametric data on the other side. So all of the ones here are non-parametric data. When we're looking at parametric data, we're talking about a normal distribution. If we go back and look at our STEM, there's no discussion about this being normally distributed or equally distributed in society. And therefore we're working on our non-parametric data side, which means that we would do a Spearman's row test. We've done quite a lot of work here for our first mark, that Spearman's row would be an appropriate statistical test. We'd then need to justify this using the information that we've already looked at in our table here. Let's break down our explanation. They should select this statistical test because they are testing a relationship between stereotypical toys recorded by the observers. By identifying that this is a correlation, we can talk about this being a test of relationship. We've put this into the context of our study by saying that we are looking at the observers who are recording the number of stereotypical toys. We're then going to give a second reason. The psychologist has ratio data as the number of stereotypical toys that the children played with is being recorded. We know that it's a Spearman's row because we've got at least ordinal data. We've been a bit more specific here and said that it's ratio data in that it has an absolute 0. We've put that into the context of our study by talking about the number of stereotypical toys. We use this to identify that this was not ratio data. Mr. Causa decides to set his English class a challenging poem. Farouk is struggling to understand the concept of alliteration. He notices that Eleonora confidently applies the concept using a silly song to remember what different poetry devices are. A psychologist decides to conduct an observation of Mr. Causa's class. Explain how the psychologist can ensure that their observation is scientific, 3 marks. We have the command word explain, which means we need to give detail and extension in our discussion here. There is also some assumed psychological knowledge here in terms of features of science, and we would need to incorporate these into our response. Because there is a STEM here, we need all of our 3 marks to be application. We need to link this into the psychologist looking at Mr. Causa's class and the specific details within the information that we've been given. Let's have a look at a response. The psychologist could use a directional hypothesis in observing learning in English, as Bandura et al. Have already conducted research into the role of modelling and imitation in learning. Here we have a clear feature of science in terms of hypothesis testing. We've also linked this back into our STEM by talking about this being in the English lesson and an understanding of the previous research in observational learning with Bandura et al. We can tick this off in our STEM in terms of the English class, so we know that we've used different parts of the STEM within our application. We're then going to look at another feature of science. The psychologist should only conduct their observation with Mr. Causa and this class to control prior beliefs of ability being an extraneous variable. We've shown another feature of science here by talking about high levels of control. We've shown control and linked this into the STEM in terms of beliefs about ability, because here we're trying to understand a concept and that might have an impact on our conclusions. For our 3rd mark, we're going to link in a 3rd feature of science. The psychologist could create an observation schedule of expected classroom behaviours to aid replication. We've identified replication as an additional feature of science. We've linked this into the STEM in terms of expected classroom behaviours, and we can tick this off in our STEM as well. Design a match pairs experiment that could be conducted on the class. In your answer, you should provide details of the aim and hypothesis of the experiment, identification and manipulation of variables including details of the task, the implementation of an appropriate experimental design, controls to minimise the effects of extraneous variables in addition to the experimental design. Justify your design choices, 12 marks. We have two separate command words for this question. Firstly, we have our design command word. This is asking us to give details of this particular study. We're going to use the bullet points in order to create our design and respond to this command word. These are all going to be put in context of Mr. Course's study and so give us 6 application marks. Our second command word is to justify. This is when we're clarifying why we have made these design decisions and what implications they have. We might want to think about strengths and weaknesses of particular things or particular design decisions in order to help us justify. There are 6 marks available for our justification, and so we want balance between our two skills. Let's have a look at a response. The aim of the experiment is to investigate the effectiveness of different techniques to understand alliteration. The alternate hypothesis is, participants using a silly song will be able to identify and explain more poetry devices than those who do not learn the poetry devices using a silly song. The null hypothesis is, there will be no difference between participants' identification of poetry devices when using a silly song or not. We've used our bullet point as a checklist, firstly providing an aim, and this is put into the context of our study, looking at the effectiveness of different techniques for alliteration. We've then given an alternative hypothesis. In our alternate hypothesis, we've given the 2 different conditions, having a silly song or not. And we've also said how we know that one participant will be better than another by saying that they would be able to explain more poetry devices. We've also got a null hypothesis, saying there'll be no difference between our conditions. We're then going to justify our choices. A directional hypothesis can be used to conduct the experiment, as there has been previous research into different memory techniques. A null hypothesis is used as a control within the study. The design of the research should be to support the null hypothesis, so extraneous variables are controlled. We've shown our psychological knowledge here in that we've written a directional hypothesis. We've justified that use because there has been previous research into different memory techniques. By discussing the nature of memory techniques, we're clearly linking this back into the STEM. We've also supported our inclusion of a null hypothesis in that this is used to control and should be used to design our study, ensuring that no extraneous variables are interfering with our result. We can tick that we've done both these skills for our first bullet point. We've designed our research and we've justified our decisions. It's time to move on to our next bullet point. The IV for the study is whether the participants learnt using the silly song or not. The DV for the study is the correct identification of 10 poetry devices within an unseen poem. After the students have been taught the poetry devices, they will be given a poem that they are unfamiliar with and asked to identify examples of different poetry devices in a 20-minute test within their school. We've shown our understanding here in terms of the independent variable and the one that changes. We've linked that back into our STEM once again by talking about whether they have a silly song or not. We've also understood that each study would have a dependent variable. We've been specific here in terms of giving a specific number of poetry devices in order to operationalise this effectively. We've also gone one step further in talking about an unseen poem. Given that we know that the maximum identification is 10 different poetry devices, we can then compare our different groups. We've also been specific in terms of how we're going to assess this with a 20-minute test in school. It doesn't massively matter about timings or the number of poetry devices, but being specific allows to give enough detail in order to aid replication. What you write down must be able to the exam board and the exam person marking it to understand that study and replicate it in the same way. We're going to use that marking criteria as part of our justification for our decisions. It is important that the researcher states how the independent and dependent variables will be measured in order for the study to be replicated. Furthermore, by measuring the dependent variable objectively through the number of correctly recalled poetry devices out of 10, there is less researcher bias. We've justified our decisions through key terminology, talking about replication and objectivity to reduce researcher bias. By having a specific quantitative value, we can reduce subjective interpretations of poetry devices. We're going to go back and tick this off in our response, so we know that we've done each of the skills we're being asked for. We've designed and manipulated the variables and given specific details of the task. It's time to tackle our next bullet point. Participants will be matched on their school year, for example Year 9, as well as gender and IQ. To match them based on their IQ, a standard test will be administered 4 weeks prior to the study beginning, and a score will be produced by the test. Once paired, one from each pair will be randomly selected out of a hat to go into the experimental group to be taught using the silly song. The other will be in a control group. We've identified an appropriate variable to match on, in terms of the school year that the participant is in. We've also said how we are going to match based on IQ. By giving a standardised test 4 weeks prior, we've been really specific about our details here. We've also talked about how we're going to sample, and therefore we've talked about how each of the pairs will go into the hat, and then one will go into the silly song condition and one will be kept in the control group. Although we might use a match pairs design in other studies, we've been really clear here how it's appropriate for this particular design and the details of the aim of our study. It's time to justify these decisions. Using a match pairs design will ensure that the effects of IQ, gender and age are limited in affecting the ability of the participants in recalling the poem. It will also mean that there is a lower likelihood of demand characteristics, as the participants are not aware that the two groups have been taught by different methods. We've said the impact of using a match pairs design, in that participants are more similar between the two conditions, and therefore this isn't having an impact on our DV. We've also talked about the fact that we have to reduce demand characteristics within this, so that we have two groups not aware that they're taught by different methods. We're going to tick this off in our instructions. We've talked clearly about a specific experimental design. It's now time to design our other controls. The participants will be taught about different poetry devices over a sequence of 4 one-hour lessons with the same teacher, using standardised slides about each of the 10 poetry devices. Examples within poems will be discussed as part of the teaching of each poetry device. Each of the participants will be tested separately in a small meeting room without any distractions for 20 minutes. We've got a real detail in our level of control, talking about not only the type of lessons and how many lessons they're going to get, but the teacher being the same and the information being the same through standardised slides. We're saying that all the examples used are going to be the same, and we're also controlling where they're tested and how they're tested. Again, the details on here don't really matter, as long as there are specific details and what you have said has been justified. Let's look at our justifications. It is important that the amount of time for the participants is the same, so that the teaching time or the teaching style does not impact the ability of the students to recall the poetry devices. By giving the participants a place to complete the assessment independently without any distractions, replicates testing in schools. By giving the participants a place to complete the assessment independently without any distractions, it replicates the testing in schools. We've explained how these might have an impact, that teaching time or teaching style might have an impact on how they recall. We could go further here and talk about different types of validity in terms of testing independently and without any distractions, mimicking school assessments. You can complete a unique version of this paper by going to our Psychology Ninjas site. Psychology Ninjas is full of free content to help you with your exams. You can save your scores with a free account.